Hello my friends, I'm Lucas and you are watching coldemonspl. If you like my work, please remember to click thumb up, subscribe to my channel and write some comment. You can also consider joining my Patreon to have access to extra content. The link is in the description below.
Okay, let's get to work. My habit is to cut all the bigger pieces just to save the space on my table. The smaller parts are still on the spruce because it's easier to find them in the box where I store them during the rest of the building stage. I decided to replace the plastic barrel for metal pipe. The 0.45mm syringe needle was used and yes, it's too big, but in the model it looks good and works perfectly with the plastic base I had. It was quite easy and only a bit of accuracy and patience during working with drill was needed. The machine gun was the only part the instructions suggest to add from the inside, even though its visible elements are outside. The reason is obvious, an easy access we have at this point. Adding it after gluing upper and lower hull would be also possible, but why make our life harder? The result is much better than using the original part from the kit. Cleaning of the wheels was boring as always. Luckily there were only 20 pieces. I started to clean them with hobby knife, but here more effective was sanding paper glued to the foam block. Making the handles with metal is always a good option, but we need to remember to make the holes in proper size. At this point only rear and front handles were replaced. The weld seams in the model were good, but not as good as I would like to have. But no, I think saying they are average is more appropriate. So a bit of brute force and they were only a piece of useless plastic. I was cleaning and preparing the place for a new one around the machine gun port, which is intended to be molded later with green stuff. In some places they were completely absent, so I kept in mind that they would have to be made. I love the small eye-catcher elements and I usually add them when it's possible. They always focus the viewer's attention, initiate the discussion, or are simply coding in mind. I hope so. As you can see here, I cut the hex bolt heads and drill some holes to simulate the missing ones. All the edges after cutting and drilling were softened with super thin plastic glue. Now it's time to make some structure of steel. Russian rough steel. I think it's clear enough and all we know what doesn't mean. There are different ways to make good looking texture. It's up to you what solution you choose and which will be the right one to use on your model. For mine I used AK Interactive Easy Cast solution. It can be diluted with tap water and I like to use it because of fast drying time. As you can see, to apply it on the model I used an old brush, which has its glory behind, but it's perfect for this purpose. One or more layers can be added, just remember to keep clean all the details. After drying, which can be speeded up with hair dryer, I sanded all surfaces with fine sanding sponge and I re-drilled the handles holes. To make handles I used 0.7mm soldering wire, which is easy to bend. This is its advantage and disadvantage at the same time. We can form different shapes, cut it with hobby knife, but on the other hand it can be damaged during the operations or after gluing to the kit. Well, we can use plastic ones from the set or fight with some harder material like copper, for example. To make the same distance from the steel I used a small balsa plank, and the only glue used here was cyanoacrylate one. The small P thread is added to the kit and the most important part on it is the mesh for engine cover. Maybe it is not so sophisticated as the other sets, but fits perfectly and we need only to bend it to form the correct shape. The step roller from RP Tools was very useful, but I also used my own fingers. A hand tool, I can say. To glue it to the kit I used black slow drying super glue. It was the perfect choice because I had couple seconds to set it properly. The glue is dry and we can make some damages. As you can see, it's easy and we can do it with any tool we have nearby. But the best to make some rips is some kind of sharp blade. Please do it gently, it's easy to overdo and ruin the part. I took a wooden block from my children's box to straighten the wire. They have different shape than the rest and I used the plastic part to make a copy. The same wooden plank you could see before was used to keep identical distance from each handle. And again I used black super glue. Thanks to this I had more time to correctly position the handles. All the excess of the glue which left on the model was washed off with a debonder. Because I'm a lazy guy, I left the side handles in plastic. They were mainly covered with the armor shields, so there is no need to replace them. Trucks. I hate plastic trucks. Sanding, sanding and more sanding. One by one. I hate this. Oh, it's me working. Now you can consider subscribing the channel. To make the work easier I use my homemade truck tool. It's simple but works perfectly. I will show it someday. Each links were glued with thin glue and left to dry. I prefer the citrus one. It smells nice but my wife hates it. Drying of the truck links shouldn't be complete because we need them still flexible and possible to form on the wheels. It is always needed to make it gently but quite quickly, which is the opposite of working with metal trucks, where we can work at any pace. Once they are on the place, small pieces of sponge were pressed into the gap between truck and the hull. They were enough to keep the truck on the place for complete drying. Both ends were saved with paper tape in correct shape. It's very important to form the trucks in natural way with sack, if it's correct of course. And this is why I love metal trucks or workable plastic trucks. They do the job without any interference. And after all, it's easier and more comfortable to work with them during painting and weathering. I always say, no more plastic trucks. And again, I struggle with them. I should listen to my wife who, looking at the time wasted, repeats,
What? Plastic trucks? Where are the frills or Masterclass?
is she right? Most likely yes. So, never more plastic trucks. And this is how they look like after forming. Now I don't need the sponge anymore. It's time for general checking. Well, honestly I love the shape of T-34 especially 76 gun version. Simple and brutal at the same time. Yeah, I know that the way I make the handles was shown, but here we have 29 handles on this kit. They took more time than cleaning the wheels. Most of them were replaced for metal ones, and I can say that it was a good choice, even time consuming. The same like before, I used the plastic parts to bend the wire for good shape. And I glued them with black superglue. This is the instruction from Aber website I printed to check what can be done to upgrade the rear fuel tanks. First the mounting bracket, then the bolts, next the second mounting bracket on the tank floor. Easy job. The same like before, I cut the bolt where the bracket will be mounted and keep it for adding later. The plastic element which can help to mount the tank on the rear wall was cut off and sanded. Based on the pictures I found on the internet, I used a set of punch and die to make some round elements which were added on the tank floor. I suppose it's some kind of drain plug or something like that. Please tell me in the comments if I'm wrong. I also added some additional mount because there were no left or right side container. Now drop of my favorite glue and the bolts I cut before were added. The antenna rod is metal part from RB model. There is also some spring in the socket. And now check this out. Another extra addition to my model were towing cables from Eureka XXL. For all of you who are not familiar with this stuff, I'm going to show the whole process of preparing them. All sets of Eureka cables are packed in the same way. The resin ends are set in small holes and cables are sticked inside the paper leaflet. There is always more than we need in case of problem with good cutting of the wire. I use typical super glue to connect the wire with ends. Now we need to make some measurements. It depends of our needs, but all ways are correct to find good length. We can use the model as a guide or vehicle manual to cut it precisely to the millimeter. It's up to you. Here I used the distance between holders to cut the cable, and both of them were cut for the same length. When the all-hole works were done, I prepared the turret. After assembling, I started again with the cast surface using the same method and product as before. Truly speaking, it will be covered in 90%, so I do it to have a clear conscience. And now it starts to look really good. Yeah. We are slowly approaching to the end, but before we can rest, the very important details need to be done. The weld seams. To form the correct lines, I prepared some extra sophisticated tools. One for U-shaped seams and the second for straight ones. The best option is 2-component putty, which has long hardening time and we can work with it quite long. After mixing both parts, the small piece of putty was rolled with a couple drops of water, which prevents from sticking to the tools. Then I applied the snakes on the model around all details which were to be welded. And after all, they look nice. Because I like this version more than the one which was offered in the box, I used the references I found in the internet and drew some cutting lines on the skirts. A few quick cuts with a hobby knife and the plastic quickly broke where I wanted and all sides were ready. Simple job. Now the shields look much better, but the upgrade is not over yet. I made some sanding to round the corners and also added some holes after missing bolts. The mudguards were more complicated because I wanted to use plastic elements. The main parts were cut from thin sheet of metal, formed and glued to the model. I also added some details, the same as it was done on plastic elements. Some bolts were also added on the side skirts. And the handles. Again. Oh my god. For the end I use a pair of pliers to make some effects of uncareful driving. And now it's ready. Yes, with no more to add or change. First of all, we have to disassemble the entire model into basic elements to have easier access to all nooks and crannies. For the purposes of photos and movie presentation, I made the model dry fitted with blue tack, which is almost as important as other tools at the modeling workbench. The individual elements such as towing cables, wheels or tracks are easier to paint separately. And later weathering is also more convenient when these elements are not glued to the model. And here's how our model looks like after disassembling into the basic elements. To avoid touching the parts while painting, I attached almost of them to the wooden sticks. For this purpose I used blue tack again, especially where no holes were available. The interior parts of the turret were strong enough to keep the stick stable. You probably find it a bit risky, but believe me, during the entire painting process this solution worked without any problems. For some parts, like the antenna for example, I have prepared special mounting holes in bamboo spikes. In the case of wheels I use the existing axle holes, which is always the simplest solution. Some parts require special handling, so a hole in an invisible place will certainly be helpful to install a wooden handle in it. Now a small trick. If we don't have any special tool for hold the model during painting, we can stick a standard nut in the hole to use the bolt as a holder. Use the super glue. After all, with a few drops of debonder we can remove the nut from the kit. Or leave it there, it shouldn't annoy anyone. This is how all the parts prepared for the primer look like. Now the model is ready to be washed, in this original sense of course. I always use water with few drops of dishwashing liquid. The soft and large brush is essential, so I'm sure no detail will come off during this spa. It is better to spend a little more time thoroughly washing the model than be surprised when the paint doesn't stick well to the surface. Of course, after washing the model must be completely dried so that unexpected drops of water don't make painting difficult. Because I decided to use AK paints, I reached for the Real Colors book to check the shades that will look best on my model. We have list of all the shades used by the Red Army with a brief explanation of the primers and camo used during the war. I started painting by applying my favorite black primer straight from the can. In the open air it dries quite quickly and soon after that I was able to start painting. In the first row I colored the rubber rims. I used for this a special shade called rubber black. It has little in common with black, it's more dark grey, but it's assumed that the tires are black, so probably this is why it is called in this way. Now you can see how useful long sticks for fastening the wheels are. Thanks to them you can manipulate with the part in all directions. Russians use red oxide primers on their vehicles the same like Germans. That's why I use a proven mixture of colors to prepare the base for the model. Generally I mix these colors in 1:1 proportion. This mixture is perfect for red oxide and only couple drops of thinner is needed for proper flow through the airbrush nozzles. In order to not waste the time painting the entire model, I focused on the chassis. All wheels, lower hull and side shields were covered with several thin layers of red primer. You may be wondering why the armor panels were also painted. The answer is very simple. The contrast after spraying the right green color will be evident enough in comparison to the rest of the hull. Now it's time to deal with the wheels. As you probably remember, I ordered quick wheel mask to paint them super thoroughly and, what is the most important, very quickly. Thanks to use of this tool it will be possible and definitely faster than using a brush or any other tool. Maybe for some of you it's a bit controversial, but in the future I will try to explain the advantages of this solution. Applying the wheels and using the mask is as simple as Lego blocks. While painting the mask, due to the concave shape, it's necessary to spray the paint from all sides to avoid the unpainted corners. Just rotate the tool and spray from different directions. However, the most important thing is to put a good primer to avoid the situation when the masking tape damage already applied paint during removing the wheels from the holes. The first shade of green was Protective K. I use it without any brightening additives, only with a thinner. The wheels were still sitting in the quick wheel mask, so I started with them, making the same rotating like before during the red primer application. Next I covered with this shade the hull and turret, where two thin coat of paint did the job. Once the paint was dry I could start applying the worn effect. Two thin layers were enough for what I intended to achieve. All surfaces, both those covered with green and those in red oxide, were covered with the same amount of lacquer. I didn't wait long to apply another color, which this time was Protective 4BO. No exact proportion of paint and thinner was used, and you can see that the consistency was quite thin. All previously painted elements were covered with this color, except for the wheels, which remained in the first green layer. All because to increase the contrast between the individual sections, even if they will be covered with matte and other weathering effects at the later stages. At this point the model began to look like a real T-34. Now it's time to use the varnish that still sits between two layers of green paint. Tap water is enough to activate this solution. I started to scratch off the paint and was a bit surprised by the size of the chips, but it wasn't a problem because in these areas most of them will be covered with matte. I was able to test it without the fear that I would overdo this effect. I started doing the same on surfaces where green was previously sprayed. Here the effects were completely different. The colors were contrasting, but not as much as red. The whole scratching lasted no more than 20 minutes, also because the drying process was accelerated by a hairdryer. The most important thing was the final effects you can see on the model at the moment. Now you can clearly see the difference between both green shades, but more spectacular is the distinction between the additional armor and the hull. Generally I don't build vehicle interiors and I try to avoid it, as for me it's a waste of time. The end result is simply not worth the effort and the time spent on building this part of the model. However, in this case I decided to put the crew figures in the turret, so the hatch had to be opened, the basic work in the interior had to be done. Even though the figures cover almost everything, I couldn't leave the parts unpainted. So to paint the interior white I masked the top hull and I did the same on the bottom. Several pieces of masking tape were also used on the driver's hatch. The white is not entirely pure white because I added a few drops of ivory. This reduces the intensity of the color a bit, but looks pretty good and will look even better after weathering. I used the hairdryer again to save the time. I gently took off the tape and checked where the paint came under the masking. Some little imperfections on the top were not a problem because they will be covered later with chipping. I painted the details red, although I wasn't sure if this color was used there. If I remember correctly, I think I saw it at Adam's Wilder Marvelous T-34, which he built several years ago. Nevertheless, it looks cool. After the paint dried, I decided to complete the driver's hatch. In an invisible place under the hinge, I scratched off some paint so that the glue got a good joint. Now you can clearly see how the paint has soaked. But don't worry, everything will evaporate in a moment and not even the slightest trace will be left. The markings time. I was wondering whether to apply the decals or paint the numbers with a brush. Both solutions have their pros and cons. For sure, the stickers applying will be faster and less stressful, but on the other hand it does not give you as many options as painting the markings by yourself. Here we have more room to show off. Some special effects can be done, but we also have to keep our brushes hard not to spoil the previous painting. I mixed the white with the ivory again and add some water. I started painting with this mixture following the example of the stickers from the set. It was not as difficult as it may seem. The good support of the hand is essential so that it doesn't hang in the air, but also a good brush and right consistency of paint will certainly be helpful. So, hold your breath. Truly speaking, painting while recording is on is stressful and uncomfortable. Additionally, the awareness that I have only one chance causes my stomach to shrink in 2 seconds. In order to paint the numbers, I first drew a general shape with a pencil and then started to paint. Hope you don't mind speeding up the movie a bit, but everything is clear, visible and you can see how I did it. The painting was demanding as before, but I caught it on the first try. Their irregular shapes look much better than the same lines offered by the model producer. And that is not an excuse, it just seemed more natural to me. I also added some extra paint stains and traces of a can that stood on the armor during painting, plus some paint spatter. And now everything is ready. It's time to paint the details. First I started adding some colors to the spotlight. However, adding colors is not a very fortunate statement because it's associated with shades other than black and silver. Here I used also a drop of satin varnish to make some plastic look of the reflector's casting. The machine gun received coated black with a little bit of silver. The metal elements of the shovel was also painted with black and silver mixed together, but I also was able to see what is hidden in the special 3G set for painting tools. There are 3 bottles of basic shades which I tested on the shovel handle, and I can say that they work pretty well. My experience with the new AK color line is completely positive. Paints are great for brushing and in the airbrush they work very good. I don't want to compare them to other paints, but I think that many modelers will be convinced of their quality. Yeah. It was some kind of advertisement. The base color was also applied to the exhaust pipes. To be honest, I didn't care too much about them because I planned to cover them with black pigment, so some fancy rust painting is pointless. Now a slightly unnatural effect, but looking pretty good on the model. All screw heads were painted silver. Yes, I know, it may look weird, but with all weathering around it does the job. In real vehicles, such elements are often rubbed off the paint and look exactly like on my model. I did the same on the wheels, even though some 90% will be covered with mud. Okay, in the end a bit of modulation. I mixed medium olive and faded green with each other more or less evenly and painted all the handles and small parts to make them brighter. Now I guess I could have used an even lighter color as the weathering toned it down and the effect was almost gone. So after all today's work, I think the model looks very good. The most important thing is that it's the base for all the muddy crap that we will put on the model in a moment. Of course, also the trucks and wheels have to be sprayed with the same paint. We can skip places that are invisible. No one will hold us responsible for it and check if we have mud under the covers or not. As you can see on the wheels, I wasn't too insightful, just a cloud of acrylic spray dust did the trick. A bottle of summer Kursk earth smiled at me when I was looking for a suitable solution. Well, of course, there is probably no better option. The pure enamel is not enough to give the mud a nice texture. I added an ordinary color pigment similar to the liquid and mixed both ingredients thoroughly. It wasn't meant to be the final mud, more the base to create an interesting structure that I was going to make with pigments. And now this slime has landed everywhere where the mud usually collects in large amounts. I had quite a while before it dried up, so there was no stress. Besides, I also planned to use a pigment fixer, so chill out. Working with pigments is always a bit messy, but many of you will confirm that they have their charm. In general, you have to be sure that there will be something to clean after such work. As you can see, I was quite generous with the application. All because after applying the pigment fixer, the texture that is visible so far will be flattened. The conclusion is simple. You have to constantly monitor how the pigment soaked in the fixer behaves. After all, when the whole thing is dry, it looks like this. It's just dry mud without any artifacts, such as stains or wet splashes of fresh mud. Hope you don't mind if I speed up a little. To make an interesting looking mud on the wheels, the kind which had accumulated there after driving through wet areas multiple times, I used the same mixture as on the hull, but here I left some pigment on the side to apply to the enamel. You can also do it in this way. After drying, just in case, I applied a few drops of fixer. It's not necessary, but it's better to add and be sure that they will stay in place. Now a more visible side. I always try to make the mud with different intensity. It may sound strange, but it works well. What does it mean? I try to arrange them so that one side of the vehicle is different from the other. In short, more here, less there. The same amount of the mud need to be presented on both sides of the wheel to have some logical explanation. It looks more realistic. Now take a look at this indicated part, which is painted with enamel with a pigment applied on it. The rest of the truck is only covered with slightly diluted Kursk earth. Both ideas are used here. The whole trucks have been painted, although the places that are invisible will not receive any pigments. They are the upper part of the truck, which will be hidden under the covers, and the lower part, which is in contact with the soil. I put the pigment only there where the trucks are visible. Of course, they were also treated with the fixer, what isn't shown here. The inner surfaces were pigmented in the same way. And this is the result. The polishing of the truck is a simple task. In the case of plastic, we cannot use sandpaper, so we are left with a simple pencil or paint. This second option is much more time consuming and only works in a few cases which depend on the shape of the links. I prefer a pencil which is faster to use and gives a more natural effects in my opinion. So here I polished all the edges and also guide teeth, even those that will be completely invisible. Remember to do it on both sides. The mud is not everything. The rubber rims won't be polished like steel idlers or drive wheels, of course. In this case it would be good to dust them properly. These particular wheels have small cuts on all circumference, which the dust undoubtedly penetrated. The same will happen when we put pigment on them, then just rub it with your finger and wipe the excess off. In the case of steel wheels like this, I usually paint the surface with silver paint or polish it with the pencil. It's worth wiping off the excess with something soft, which at the same time will make it even more smooth and give a nice shine. Now we can combine all the prepared elements together. The road wheels, drive and idler ones, and the most important parts, which are the trucks. Sometimes brute force is needed to fit everything into place, but it's important not to damage the painted surface during the installation. The moment has finally come and I was able to close the chassis by gluing the side covers. To have some room for maneuver I used long drying glue. Thanks to this I was able to position the plates without stress and press them down so that the glue got a good bond. I additionally reinforced the ends with a drop of super glue, especially because I combined plastic with a metal fender. Thanks to the metal primer, painting the towing cables is a breeze. Without it, the paint rubs easily when placing them on the model. All corrections are quite difficult, especially as the paint must stick to the edge that is without primer. A regular spray primer is a bit too weak and can only be applied after this product application. I painted the whole ropes with an ordinary brush, paying attention to all the cavities between the individual fibers which need to be covered with paint. A faded green from AK was perfect for this purpose. After that I prepared a very dark brown to paint the scratches. In this case the most effective and the quickest tool is a sponge, because painting with it makes it possible to obtain irregular scratches in various shapes, almost unique. It's important to remember to have small amount of paint on sponge. If not, we will ruin the effect with one touch. To paint the scratches in the center of the eyelets I used the brush. It would be difficult to make it with a sponge. Now the question: how to put the rope on the bar? The answer is very simple. Just cut the piece open. Then gently press and it's done. Now you can form the rope into the shape you need and glue or not to the model. The best visual effects will be obtained when the rope is not in the perfect alignment. Before the next step I covered the entire model with satin varnish. This will make it easier for me to apply a wash that spreads better on the semi-glossy or glossy surface. A ready-made AK product which perfectly matched with my model's color was at hand. Of course, you have to dilute it to make the application easy and the wash spread nicely around the details. After drying I cleaned the excess. Around the small elements I tried to do it as gently as possible, but there were places where I used a large brush to wipe away the excess of wash to put it into vertical stains. When we have a single color model, it's worth using oil paints to make the individual surfaces more interesting. Different shades of sand and yellow, blue and of course green will match the base color on our kit. The best results will be seen when the model is slightly weathered, otherwise the color effects will disappear under the layer of dust and mud. With a little practice it can be done quite quickly, so here, although the final layout was intended to be different, I decided to paint most of the surfaces to show what effect we can achieve. I think it's a great technique. Look at the samples of my other models where you can clearly see how the oil paint changed the base color. I think this looks really cool, doesn't it? I can divide the scratch painting into 3 stages. The first stage is painting with a sponge, exactly the same as before with towing cables. The difference is that you need to plan the places where the chips should appear. The front and rear fenders, handles, edges of the hatches, hull sides exposed to scratches by brush branches are the basic and the most often painted spots on our models. The second is speckling. I usually use more tint paint because it will give better results. All this is for keeping the paint wet during the flight from the brush to the surface. It sounds a bit weird, but this is how it looks like. The third and the last is rusting. Oil paints are the best solution. I have two shades of rust color and I use them alternately. I mix the white spirit with paint and I apply the wash to the places where chips are already painted. In the case of towing cables, the rust will appear along the entire length and additionally at the ends. To wash off the excess, just use white spirit. It's important to check exactly how this effect looks like after it's completely dry. Very often the color intensity changes and we need to make corrections. In contrast to previous work, now we'll dirty the model a little. For this purpose I use two shades of grey and sometimes black or dark brown. It's very easy, but the most important thing is to know where to apply the paint. With no doubts around the turret's ring because no one wipes this place. The hatches are the most obvious location where the crew has their constant walking paths. Of course, a lot depends on the type of the vehicle. You have to touch different places on the Tiger and others on the T-34, it's obvious. If we won't save the time, we can and even have to cover the entire model with a flat varnish. This will protect our previous achievements and we won't worry about damages caused by the next weathering steps. Now some vertical stains that are only apparently barely visible. In a moment you will see how much they will stand out. I covered the model with worn effect again. The trick is to spray Tamiya buff and make a layer of an old dust. The chassis was covered in an improvised way because there was enough dust and mud effects. The buff was sprayed the most on low surfaces but also a little higher to keep the dust on the vehicle in logical order. Please forgive me, I'm not showing how the paint was washed off, I just forgot to record it, but the effect is quite visible, exactly as I said. I prepared a matte mixture again to put it on the side covers. Take your time and plan well which places needed to be matted. It is worth working on appropriate texture immediately, even though we will apply additional pigment later to enhance this effect. In this case I was concerned with completely dry matte, which would reflect the reason in which this vehicle was operating. Of course, you could add some wet and dark spots at the same time, but I decided to put everything on one card. Maybe it's not spectacular, but looking at the model from a distance, the whole thing looks very good. The matte applied by the brush was enriched by tiny splashes, which I tried to locate most near the rear of the vehicle and at the front, where it could actually accumulate during off-road riding. I added some pigment and using a cotton bud I dabbed it into the surface, or rather rolled it, which always gives a nice results. In the end, the usual pigmentation with a soft brush completed the process. Maybe for some it won't be acceptable, but I rubbed the edges of the side handles with my fingers. Thanks to this I whipped off the dust and there was a greater contrast between them and the dusty armor. Okay, the mud is done, so now the pure dusting of the rest of the model. To imitate exhaust fumes, it's enough to use black pigment. In the case of T-34 I don't play with great painting of the exhaust because they are too short and additionally I covered them in 99%. Of course the way how the fumes fit on a vehicle depends on many factors. However, here we built a model and some effects need to be overexposed. Note that even the towing cable is dirty with logical consistency. Now some polishing. Screws on the side covers, edges, machine gun, towing cables are the elements that must have a metallic shine. First of all, this is what they look like, and secondly, a bit of silver won't hurt the model, especially as it's supposed to imitate the vehicle made of steel. Why I want to use the wash at this stage? For some spills, stains and splashes. This product is ideal for creating the effects I've just mentioned. It's easy to control and dries faster than oil paints. The volume obviously depends on the amount of thinner which was added. In addition, the surface on which we apply is also important. Otherwise it will be absorbed into pure paint and otherwise into pigment or mud. That's all for today's episode, my friends. Subscribe the channel and give me a like. Just do it. This will be a signal to me that everything is going in the right direction. You can help me to build the community by adding the comments, suggestions on what sucks and what you like. I will try to answer the questions, maybe not in a minute, but I will do it as soon as possible. To encourage you to watch the upcoming episode, I can say that next time I will show you how to enrich the model with accessories such as tarps, tools, birch beam and more. There will be also something about the figures that I have prepared for this model, so don't forget next Monday. Oh, check out my Instagram every evening to look at the other models I have built, photos from the workshop or interesting shots that will definitely come in handy while working on the model. Ta-da! 4 horsemen, tankmen of the apocalypse. This figure is a German Panther art product with some minor modifications. The commander is plastic from Masterbox but with a resin head and boots from the first figure. The third crew member is a guy from Stalingrad miniatures. And the driver is also from Masterbox. I added the resin head and a little surgery to make it easier to fit. Some trick and the figures are painted. Right at the beginning I glued the driver to the correct place. The slow drying glue was essential as it was hard to set the figure in the perfect position at once. The simple tissue paper is perfect material for tarps. Just cut them to the correct size and separate the layers. 2 are more than enough. Now dilute some PVA glue with tap water and mix it with the color you want on your tarp. Next, soak the paper with the color and dry it. I always use a hair dryer because it makes my work much faster. The material shouldn't be completely dry, but it also shouldn't get our fingers dirty. Then you can start molding it to the shape you need. While doing this, I always try to make it look as natural as possible and wonder how the crew would do it in the field. All imperfections can be done at this stage. If someone wants, then adding some extra details like strings, metal eyelets, seams and more, I suggest doing after it's completely dry, when the paper is already harder and easier to work with. From time to time you can moisten the tarp with water mixed with glue to make the arranging easier and to stick it to the surface. I always try to add some human factors. Here the easiest and quite obvious one was to put the captured submachine gun with spare magazines. It could be a defense weapon in the situation of unexpected attack during the march, or when the infantry wouldn't be able to keep up the pace or would already be dead. Okay, now we have tarps ready and we can take care of the shading. To make highlights and shadows I used 2 colors, light and dark grey. They were enough to add a 3D effect. The painting itself wasn't a big challenge, we need to remember to make it look natural. It's easy to paint the paper when it's completely dry, and as you can see, the folds look very realistic. All because the paper was quite thin and easy to arrange. Of course, this is one of several ways to make cool looking tarps, and I hope to show some more tricks in the future. Now I could add the first crew member. His positioning was crucial for the other 2 figures. A drop of superglue to get a good position, and then I added a little bit more to the invisible places inside the turret. The commander is leaning on with his left leg, so when I was sure that the glue was dry, I started to set him up. The third figure was the easiest task. Now it turned out that somehow a small crevice was created under the commander's ass. Such a mistake is easy to fix. Just make a small blanket that could be used as a bit of luxury during field operations. I prepared everything exactly as before, with the difference that it was painted in a slightly more sophisticated pattern. I didn't care too much about its straight lines because they won't be visible after folding. Now I took Dragon's second generation frame because the MP40 which I used earlier to arrange the tarp was some waste. The detailing is really good and the only thing added was a belt. To raise the realism level I added a spare magazines, and it's very possible that such a weapon would have a chance to slide off the turret while riding, but I leave it to the theoretical deliberations. The pigment was useful to do some weathering on the tarps. A small amount may change the appearance a lot and you have to be careful because it's easy to overdo. Do you remember the models I showed in the previous episode? One of them, more precisely a demon from Croatia, had birch beams. It looks great to me, especially as it contrasts with the dark color of the vehicle. Now I have the opportunity to show how a realistic beam can be made from handy materials and even from waste. As you noticed, I cut the old brush handle to the correct length. I wrapped the copper wire that the model manufacturers add to the sets around the pin and stuck it stiffly. Now I wrapped everything in paper and soaked with PVA glue. If you want to ask about the color, there was some remnant of paint in the container, so that's why it looks like this. I cut off the excess of paper, soaked more with glue and dried it with warm air. How to make a bark? It's very simple. The Easy Cast solution is perfect for this, and as you can see, the surface easily resembles a real tree. Now it was possible to start the painting. This color was perfect for my beam. We all know that the birch is generally a fairly light tree, but its base color is dark green or even grey. It all depends on the angle from which we look at them. For white bark, ivory paint fits perfectly. In order to make the right surface with the base color visible, it's best to paint it in an inaccurate but controlled manner. I think what you see shows better how it's supposed to look and what I'm talking about. On the other hand, the structure I made using the Easy Cast solution is very helpful. Some corrections with the base color, and additionally we can apply pure white to add some highlights. The bark is almost ready. Only thin lines with the base color are left to paint. Both ends should be finished flat. I previously glued the tips with superglue and sanded them after it dried. Now I took the wood base to paint them. I checked on the internet whether the birch trees have visible trunk rings. It turned out that not. I just added the dark edges of the bark and made a fine wash on the ends. It's time to finish the spare tracks. My plan is to paint and weather them as if they were from some destroyed vehicle. Therefore, right after applying the base color, I started adding the dry matte. Just like before, the Kursk earth has been additionally enriched with the pigments. I rubbed the whole thing gently with a cotton bud. After polishing, I applied some oil paint rust, but very gently. The exaggeration in this case would ruin the whole effect. We go back to the beam. Now it must be attached to the vehicle. The thin wires that I have wrapped around the handles and the beam will be the best for this purpose. In my opinion, such prosaic elements as wire or string should have the appropriate thickness. Nothing spoils the overall appearance more than thick rope or wire used to tie a stowage down. The old electric motors are a good source of obtaining such a wire. They can also be pulled out of the electric cables. Later is enough to heat them in a fire to make more flexible. the additional tarp will undoubtedly add more realism to our model. Just see how I worked on it. In the open box series I mentioned that I have some imperfections on the motor levers. Now they had to be covered, and the best thing for that was a little rag. The method is the same as before, only the color is slightly different. When the tarp on the beam was already dry, I took care of painting it properly. I am talking about shadows and highlights, of course. Additionally, I added an axe to slightly break the colors. There are also some small artifacts on the right side, all to make the model look even more interesting and natural. Okay, now something for the back of the vehicle. What you can see is a standard chain from RB model previously soaked in liquid for metal blackening and wrapped slightly with a rusty pigment. I have prepared the section of 1 meter and cut it off if necessary, piece by piece, adapting it to a specific model. So here was enough to lightly polish it with a metallic pigment, and then the chain was ready to be placed on the model. The best place was the back plate. There are hooks on which this element can be attached nicely. Finally, a little dust to unify it with the vehicle. The dust was also applied to the bottom of the beam where it would accumulate while riding. In this case I didn't need exact lines, so I used a free hand to cut them open. These small points were used to guide the knife relatively straight. The edges were sanded a bit, and the next step was to trim the cardboard to make the floor of our base. Now all the boards must be glued together, but it's necessary to keep the right angles. After a few minutes the frame was done. As you can see, there are also the brackets both on the walls and the floor. It's better to have them because then the structure is 100% stable. Minor differences in the point where both boards meet together can be easily removed with a sharp knife. A bit of sanding, of course, and we can move on to the next stage. This strange structure inside are the supports under the display area. I made them from the remains, so they aren't visually perfect, but they will certainly fulfill the task. On the top I can now attach another piece of cardboard, but because I ran out of the material a bit, so I matched the leftovers and sealed the joint with masking tape. Now 2 minutes to complete smoothing of the side walls with sanding pad. Then I glued soft pads on the bottom to protect the surface and easily move the whole thing. Okay, now we can start building the terrain. This product is ideally suited for this purpose. It's easy to apply, dries quickly, and most importantly is ready to use all the time. When it gets a little dry, we can boldly imprint the traces of the wheels in it, just like here where we used a simple tool with metal tracks to prepare the traces that the tank leaves on the path of its passage. It's time to work on additional landscape elements. We can cut boards from thin plywood or veneer, which will be great for building an old damaged fence. I cut the brackets out of toothpicks and glued with each horizontal board. The PVA glue was the best because I had time to set up each piece. Thanks to the fact that I used different lengths and finishes of the planks, the whole thing is very atmospheric and stylish. I set various sizes of stones onto the almost dry ground and then glued them with a fixer. It took a while for the glue to dry, and I played a bit with acrylics on both wooden elements. The pole and the fence were also treated with AK chemistry, and more precisely with dark green enamel to create a little rotten wood effect. Here's some extra detailing to the individual fence boards. Namely, on each of them there is a nail. Let's say a nail, and the rusty speck that usually remains after many years. As you can see, it was easy to make, the same as painting, a few minutes and the effect is great. As you probably noticed, the whole ground has already been covered with the primer, and now we are going to apply gardener and glue on ready-made patches of AK grass. They are ready to use, well, almost ready to use, because we will paint them later. But before the grass painting, we need to make some colors on the soil. Of course, I used the same products that were applied to the model, because the color combination of all elements is basic. In addition, I also planted a small tree. Maybe it's not seen well, but I think it fits perfectly here and complements the scene. The link to the tree producer is in description, and I'm sure many of you know his awesome works. After soil-based painting, I focused for a moment on the grass. First I applied the base color, which was Tamiya flat green, and then with an addition of yellow I added a lightening to all the clumps. The effect is great and I think it's much better than unpainted grass. I diluted summer Kursk earth a lot with white spirit and started to apply it all over the soil. I carefully traced the clumps of grass, and when it was done, I speeded up the drying with a hairdryer. After that I was able to paint stones. As you can see, they are quite contrasting to the soil. Now I could glue the fence into the holes drilled earlier and set up the pole with ready-made road signs which come from Paper Plus model set. To tone down the colored stones, I covered the whole surface with the pigment used for weathering on the vehicle. Then I poured white spirit all over it. Once it dried up, I started to remove the masking tape. In some places I had to use the hobby knife to cut it straight with the edge of the balsa. And this is how it looks like a step before the end. I painted all the walls black with a few drops of satin varnish. I put 3 layers on all sides. Here you can see the effect after first layer. It did the job completely and the boards are black the way I like. Now I have completed the title of the work using laser cut letters from yen models. I gently sanded them and prepared the place of final location. The masking tape helped to glue the letters in straight line, and they were all glued with PVA glue, and I easily removed the excess when needed. Luckily, even if a little bit remains, it will be almost invisible after drying. And finished! What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments if you like my work or if I should throw my tools away. I hope you had a good time and something interesting caught your eye. Summing up my work and experience from the last weeks, especially as a movie maker, I must admit that it wasn't easy. I expected to learn everything, but I didn't think it would take so much effort. Nevertheless, the beginning is behind me, I made the first step and I know that there is still a lot to do. A lot. And I'm sure you know this, but I need to say that it's highly recommended to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment and share with others. And if you are here for the first time, feel free to join the community. I post interesting photos on Instagram every day, so check what's new. Apart from the news, there are also some pics of my previous models, so it will be really nice to see you there. In the next episode I will deal with a rather interesting topic that appeared on my list quite unexpectedly. Today I will not reveal the secret, but I'm very curious what will come of it. I collected quite a lot of accessories and I have in my mind some ideas to implement on this model, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching, see you next time, cheers!